even the Iranian Revolution, many other revolutions around the world, in terms of how radical it was. And what does that mean about the anti-Zionist movement? What does it mean about the forces that are trying to drive back Israel? Well, if you regard Israel as being part of an extension of Western colonialism, then it's easy to understand how the fight against Israel is revolutionary, right? The French had 1 million settlers in Algeria, and the Algerians rose up in revolution against the French. But what happens if that fight is actually a fight against the revolution itself? What you then have is a very fascinating development of trying to roll back the achievements of a revolution. And I want to try to understand just how much this makes sense in a historical context, and how much the anti-Israel activism that you might experience on campus fits within that same historical context. You see, after the French Revolution, for example, where the revolutionaries threw off the monarchy, what did the anti-revolutionaries want to do, the counter-revolutionaries? To restore the previous order. They wanted to put the peasants back in their place and reinstall the monarchy. Or think even about the Russian Revolution after that took place, and how other countries tried to overthrow the Bolsheviks and restore the ancient order. Think even about Iran. We're still having conversations about whether the United States wants regime change, and people will support the Shah's heir to try to restore the situation as it was before. You see this with other social movements as well. For example, think of the big sexual liberation of the 1960s, and the way that you now have movements in the United States, for example, wanting to restrict abortion rights, for example. All part of the same context of saying, this was the power relationship, you changed the power relationship, we want to put it back in its place. And I think this counter-revolutionary spirit really expresses why anti-Zionism is different from criticism of any mere state, and why it spills over so often into overt anti-Semitism. First of all, because anti-Zionism, and part of this is the boycott movement we see on university campuses, is a forcible attempt to deprive Jews of a fundamental right that they currently enjoy, which is the right to self-determination. Anti-Zionism is not just sitting back and wondering about, oh, maybe in 1948 people should have made a different decision. It's an active attempt to say Jews should not have the right to self-determine as a people anymore. It's a right they have. It's a right we want to take away from them. The second reason is that it fails to view Jews as political equals. What Zionism tried to do is to say, remember, as I said, we don't want equality within nations. We want equality as a nation, as a separate people. And what anti-Zionism tries to do is to, by claiming that Israel has no right to exist, by applying pressure in order to pursue that end, is an attempt to say, actually, no, we want the Jews to go back to where they were before, namely minorities in other communities, in other cultures, where they will be, as we learn from history, essentially the whims of stronger powers. But I think the third most interesting reason is that what anti-Zionism, the counter-revolution, wants to do is to expose Jews to dangers to which they have no solution. I do wonder, if you start a conversation with the anti-Israel radicals on campus, what they expect to happen to the Jewish majority living here if the right of return were granted, for example, and this country were to become a binational state with an Arab majority. Do they think that the Jews would be well treated here? Do they think maybe they don't deserve to be well treated? Jews from a long and bitter experience, the Zionist narrative at least has been that the only way that Jews can guarantee their safety is if they are able to defend themselves and to practice self-determination. And what the anti-Israel boycott movement and others try to do is to drive that back and say, no, we reject your solution to the problem. And actually, we're not concerned at all about proposing another solution and proposing something else that could make you feel comfortable. So I just want to be able to set the stage now before the discussion with Adam about a few thoughts about ways to think about the anti-Israel movement, anti-Israel activism, and the role that it's doing They very much claim that mantle of being an insurgency and being revolutionary. And I think that if we change our perceptions and actually think about what Israel is trying to do as still being part of a very revolutionary project, and what the anti-Israel movement is trying to do is part of an effort to roll that back and to restore the old power dynamics that force the Zionist movement to say we need change because Jews do not have existential security in this respect. Offer some food for thought for how to rethink about what this battle is, what this struggle is, and maybe some ways to move forward. So on that note, I want to introduce Adam. And Adam, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, Eylon.
How are you coping in self-isolation?
Working in a small apartment surrounded by a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old is challenging at times. Sometimes they come in while I'm working and they don't quite understand the whole idea of Abba's working. But other than that, I can't complain.
I can see they're responsible for the artwork in your office there.
Yes, definitely.
Adam, I want to ask you a few questions. I think all of us right now are watching Fauda. Those of us who are not connected to Yes, we're all watching Fauda on Netflix. I think the series does an incredible job of humanizing both sides, thinking through their feelings, their rationales. But I think if one thing is clear from the series, is we definitely wouldn't want to swap positions with the Palestinians and live in the reality that they're in. Now, terrorism is obviously wrong and an illegitimate tactic for the Palestinians to try to change their political situation. And boycotts are also wrong. Pursuing international recognition is also wrong. What do you think would be a legitimate form? Is there a legitimate way for the Palestinians to try to pursue political change vis-a-vis Israel? I mean, if Palestinian activists were coming to you and saying, look, we're sick of being called anti-Semitic all the time, what can we do that wouldn't be, quote unquote, anti-Semitic or anti-Israel? What would you advise them?
Well, let me answer that in two ways. Number one, they're not just called anti-Semitic. I mean, those of us that take anti-Semitism seriously and have made the arguments in posts and op-eds that their society is compromised by endemic anti-Semitism cite empirical data by ADL, by Pew Global, that suggests that Palestinian society is the most anti-Semitic society in the world. 93% according to ADL. 2011, the Pew Global poll showed that only 3% of Palestinians had favorable views of Jews, not Israelis, but Jews. So I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I just want to make clear that the one thing they can do is stop, is trying to create a society where anti-Semitic views are considered unacceptable. The same way that racism is considered unacceptable in the West, that I think the international community has to hold them accountable to the same moral standards as they hold other countries. And that would go a long way, I think, if they were yeah, go ahead.
No, it would definitely go a long way, and I don't think anyone would dispute there's a lot of sort of cleansing of the stables that needs to be done there in terms of anti-Semitic conceptions and rhetoric. But if they were to come to you and say, look, we want to get our house in order and stop using these anti-Semitic ideas, what tactics, like what is legitimate for pro-Palestinian activism on campus? What tools are available to them if boycotts, for example, we say are anti-Semitic? Like what tactics are legitimate?
Coexistence projects, projects that bring Jews and pro-Palestinian activists together, projects that bring Palestinians and Israeli Jews together. The one thing they can do politically is to promote the idea that their leaders should enter negotiations with Israelis without preconditions. And I say without preconditions because that's typically their Abbas and previous demands that Israel release X number of Palestinian prisoners before they even agree to talk. So I can see no reason why, if I was a Palestinian agitating for a state, and I think that's a completely legitimate aspiration, that why on earth would you want a political leader that is hesitant or refuses to sit down and negotiate without preconditions? I think that's been, the Palestinian leadership and their refusal to say yes to legitimate offers for statehood has been one of the biggest obstacles to achieving peace. They could have had peace in 2000, 2001. They could have had peace in 2008. Even during the Obama administration, Abbas demanded that Israel to release over 1,000 prisoners, all of which had blood on their hands. So I can think of no rational reason why a Palestinian leadership that wanted to have a peaceful outcome would be hesitant to hold negotiations one-on-one without preconditions.
Right. That's really interesting that you raised sort of the round of negotiations from 2008, because one of the things that has changed since is that, at least under Olmert, there was an Israeli government that was committed, and not just in rhetoric, to a two-state solution. And what we have now is, God willing, one day there will be a government here, right? But the government that is being set up is one that says explicitly, we are against a two-state solution. We want to begin an annexation of the West Bank, of Judea and Samaria, has the backing of the American administration, even if what remains, in these little islands they call a Palestinian state. And I wonder, do you as a pro-Israel activist worry sometimes about maybe hyperinflation of the term anti-Israel or anti-Semitic? So when you have, for example, Israeli leaders who say that wanting to boycott settlement products, for example, is anti-Semitic, for example. If Israel isn't able to draw the lines of what being anti-Israel means, are you worried that the line between being anti-Israel, being anti-Israeli policy just becomes mush the moment Israel says, look, we're not interested in the two-state solution?
Yeah, absolutely. I've made this point repeatedly on social media and on our blog, that the pro-Israel community has to be extremely careful about misusing the term anti-Semitism, misusing terms like blood libel when it has no historical resonance to the ancient blood libel. I always use the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, working definition of anti-Semitism, which has been accepted by 31, maybe more states. And I agree. I think that those who use the word anti-Semitism carelessly do our movement, do those who want peace and who love Israel and want to seek a peaceful solution, grave harm by using the term flippantly, by using the term just to refer to any policies they don't like. It's kind of like the term fake news, right? Like, there was a time that fake news meant news.
Fake news.
Yeah. And oftentimes now it just means news we don't like, right? So you make a really good point, and I would really urge activists out there to use that term sparingly, and only if it clearly falls within the parameters of the IRA working definition.
That's interesting. One of the things I notice, let's think with our media hats on now, is that in the media there's very little coverage of internal Palestinian politics. I mean, when I think of how much there's been in the international media about Israel's political crisis in the last year, that sort of conversation about Palestinian politics, entirely absent the fact that Mahmoud Abbas, may he have a long life, is now 13 years, 14, 15, 16 years into a 4-year term. I can't even remember anymore. None of the discussion is never discussed in the context of being an undemocratic, autocratic leader. There doesn't seem to be any nuance when it comes to discussing the internal Palestinian scene. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's interesting. Matty Friedman, in his groundbreaking op-ed in Tablet in 2014, made that point really well.
It's an outstanding column, by the way, and everyone should, as soon as we finish, check that Matty Friedman essay.
Yeah, it's a must-read. I mean, to me, it changed the way I think about pro-Israel activism, about the conflict, the way it's covered by the media. But, he makes the point that, and he was the former AP Jerusalem correspondent, I believe, and he makes the point that Palestinian politics, Palestinian economics, Palestinian culture, Palestinian corruption, Palestinian ideology is almost never discussed. Now, I think the reason for this has to do with the fact that a lot of those out there, whether it be some journalists, not all, but some journalists, and certainly pro-Israel, pro-Palestinian activists, don't impute agency to Palestinians. They don't see them as agents of their own fate. They always see them acted upon, never as actors. That's a dynamic that's been termed by a writer named Jim Sleeper as liberal racism. It's alternately been termed the soft bigotry of low expectations. and that is when it's racist insofar as a lot of activists don't really see the Palestinians as capable of being held to the same standards as Westerners are. So if you were to show them evidence that there's corruption, that there's racism, that there's dysfunction within Palestinian society, it's typically ignored. I think just have this ideology, which is in part motivated by or in part informed by intersectional ideologies, which hold that certain groups, by virtue of their victimhood status or perceived victimhood status shouldn't be held morally accountable for their actions, and that
and I want to unpack that in just a little bit to understand what exactly we mean by intersectionality. I mean, it's interesting that you talk about the bigotry of low expectations and failing to impute agency to the Palestinians. One of the best examples I can think of. I don't know whether I should be revealing this. When I did my army service, I served in COGAT, the coordinator of government activities in the territories. And I served in the headquarters where we had meetings every day, Palestinian officials, international community, fascinating experience. And we had one meeting, and I had to dig up my notes because I wanted to make sure that I was remembering this correctly. And I nearly fell off my chair or choked on my coffee. We were speaking to one European Union official. I think he was British, and discussing corruption in the Palestinian Authority. And he compared the Palestinians to mice. And this is the point I nearly fell off my chair. He said, and I quote, "Corruption isn't great, but if you put mice in a box that gets smaller and smaller, they start fighting with each other." And I was absolutely flabbergasted that he was sitting there comparing using that metaphor of comparing the Palestinians to mice. But I think it's a really, really excellent example of that perception that regards the Palestinians as that it's not just a dynamic of stronger and weaker parties, but that the dynamic is so strong that the Palestinians have no agency or sense of responsibility at all. And then they're not asking interesting questions about, well, not tactically are the Palestinians doing the right thing, but is it possible that the whole movement has gone astray? Is it possible that their whole strategy has a serious problem?
Yeah, it's interesting also. I mean, first of all, it's interesting that mice analogy, that's obviously a anti-Semitic meme, Jews as vermin. That's interesting that they would have used that. But, also I oftentimes think that and this is related to what you asked, I'll get around to what you asked, but I oftentimes think that one of the reasons why there's this instinctual hostility to Zionism, or at least this instinctual hostility to Israel as such, is that we've proven that we don't need the help of social justice warriors to live in a vibrant, free, democratic, progressive, economically prosperous state. That we're no longer living in shtetls. We're no longer living as tiny minorities oppressed by the large minority. That we're thriving, right? So we've proved that a historically oppressed minority can, through hard work and determination and grit, overcome their historic oppression and become.
But that doesn't work with the theory, does it?
Right. Well, exactly. Right. So, as long as they hold this view, right, I think ultimately it's about them. I think ultimately it's a narcissism, ultimately about what they want to do in the world, they being the activist. And I don't want to tar all journalists with the same brush, but certainly the advocate journalists, the journalists that are clearly on the Palestinian side, right? That's not you. That this is they can't unwrap their minds around themselves that every ideology they've been taught in college about liberation movements, about how we implement change, how we get the world to be more progressive, is based on the idea that Western liberals need to be the agents of the victims' change, not that those victims should be the agents of their own change. And we completely disprove that, contradict that paradigm. So that goes back to your question, right? I mean, I think that there's a psychological and ideological motivation why they refuse to hold Palestinians responsible the same way they hold us responsible. Because otherwise, what would they do? Otherwise,
and I think that's a very interesting point, Adam, especially in the context of the Palestinian refugee camps, for example. The fact that in the West Bank, Gaza, there are still Palestinian refugee camps. As far as Mahmoud Abbas is concerned, He's proclaimed the state of Palestine, and yet there are refugee camps for refugees from Palestine on his soil. And no one in the international community seems to think that's a little bit strange, or to expect them to dismantle refugee camps that, as far as they're concerned, are on their own sovereign soil. None of that serious questioning about ways that they can take their fate into their own hands in constructive ways. Everything seems to go through that very narrow lens of what tactics can they use against Israel rather than how they can actually transform reality. I want to ask you a question before we move on. I see we're running a little bit out of time, and I want to get onto the questions that are beginning to come in from our audience. We've been talking a lot about how the anti-Israel movement needs to be more self-conscious about what exactly it's doing and start questioning its own motives. I want to ask you a question about some of the way that pro-Israel activists see some of the pressure that's applied against Israel. I want to use one of the terms that's very common on the anti-Israel left, which is not necessarily the anti-Israel left, but within the left, the concept of triggering. Many people, I think, struggle to understand why Israelis get so het up about boycotts and why they believe that these are anti-Semitic. And I think that for many Jews, when they hear boycotts, the immediate word association in their head is the Nazi signs that said, "Don't buy from Jews." We hear boycotts, and even if other people think, oh, this is just a form of consumer boycott, I don't have to buy things that are bad for the environment, or I don't have to buy things if the owner of this company I think is a bad person. They think that consumer boycotts are an entirely legitimate, non-violent form of protest. But we hear boycott and we're immediately triggered because we think back to Nazi Germany, and that's the image it puts in our mind. Do you think that's right? And maybe because of those associations, pro-Israel activists maybe overreact about the extent of the threat? And on the other hand, do you think that the other side fails to understand why they're pressing on such a sensitive point?
Yeah, that's a good question. A few things. First of all, I think it's important to note that the IRA working definition doesn't explicitly state that BDS is anti-Semitic. It says that holding Israel to double standards that no other country would be held to is anti-Semitic, but it kind of, is broad enough that it doesn't really, it'll say that comparing Israel to Nazi Germany is anti-Semitic, but it doesn't say that BDS is anti-Semitic. Right. And I think that the pro-Israel community has to be careful to embrace that nuance and to be able to communicate that nuance. But I think that the reason why that it's most in the pro-Israel community, certainly most Jews react to the idea of BDS the way they do is because, look, people are free to make consumer choices however they wish. If, we go into a supermarket and decide not to buy a product from Israel and instead buy a product from Lebanon, that's fine. But we're talking about you're a political activist and you have limited amount of energy to engage in that activism. You look around the world, hell, you look around the Middle East, and you're focusing your efforts in your mind on where the greatest opportunity for, where the greatest injustices, and the mental thinking that works you to believe that Israel is the most, wickedly malevolent, unjust place in the world, or even in the Middle East, is just profoundly irrational. I mean, you don't have to take our word for it, right? You can, if you peruse the site of Freedom House, the internationally respected human rights organization, Israel is by far the most progressive state in the Middle East. So, you have to ask yourself, if you're an anti-Israel activist, you're choosing to devote a limited amount of activism energy to the state that happens to be the state that is most progressive towards religious minorities, the most progressive towards the LGBT community, the most progressive in terms of political freedoms, civil rights, the rights of the free press. So it's the moral hypocrisy that I think, in addition to the associations with Nazi Germany, the associations with historical anti-Semitism, it's just the profound, I think, indefensible moral hypocrisy of deciding that the only state you're going to boycott is Israel, and that state, just so happens to be the only Jewish state in the world. So I think that's a question that I've never seen any pro-Palestinian activists really answer, is why Israel? They try to answer, but I've never seen a really good answer.
Right. I think it's interesting also in the context of understanding how these policies are sometimes applied in such an unreflective way. I mean, a while ago, if you remember the debate that was taking place in the Irish Parliament about the bill to ban commerce with Israel, the bill stated that it would be a criminal offence to engage, to buy settlement products. And I watched the debate in the Irish Parliament. There was absolutely no reflection or thought about whether that was proportionate, because the more that sort of that self-confidence, that moral self-righteousness, and the belief that we are right, Israel wrong, put them in this bizarre situation where anyone who wants to buy a bottle of wine from a settlement would be exposing themselves to time in jail. I think it's a really good example of how twisted the dynamic is.
Right, and it's important also to know that, and I know you've produced videos to this effect. I know you know this, but the BDS leaders almost entirely, certainly the main BDS leaders, are on the record as opposing any future which will include the existence of a Jewish state within any borders. So the movement itself is compromised by an anti-Semitic view that their end goal isn't peace and justice and coexistence and two states living side by side. Their goal is clear: the end of the Jewish state within any borders. And you can't separate the movement from the activists. I mean, they're part of a movement that really has a malevolent goal, and that's a big part of why Jews and pro-Israel activists on campus respond the way they do.
Okay, Adam, we have a few questions coming in from our audience. It's always a shame we have to do this on Zoom rather than with an actual audience, because it's difficult to. Sometimes we forget we're actually talking into screens by ourselves, and it's always nice to have the human touch. But a few questions coming in. You were discussing before that one of the legitimate forms of protest of the Palestinians would be working on coexistence projects, and one of the tensions there is that what they want really is to separate from Israel. And what we're seeing now with the coronavirus crisis is a really interesting dynamic that is, on the one hand, requiring the sides to stay apart. We're all social distancing, but on the other hand, there is cooperation. There has to be cooperation because viruses don't respect borders. So the question we have from Ben Stone here is how you think that COVID-19 and the cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority might shape the debate on either side. Maybe that recognition of certain problems that don't respect borders, even if you want to put one down.
Look, I wish I could be more optimistic. I don't think the long-term impact will be significant. I think it's wonderful. I think it's especially wonderful in that it's been, the extraordinary cooperation between Israel and the Palestinians on coronavirus has been recognized even by the UN, by voices that typically don't recognize positive things that Israel does. But I think at the end of the day, when the virus has been defeated, unfortunately, I don't see any long-term positive impact from the admittedly impressive cooperation between the two parties.
Going back to what you were saying before, you said the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism doesn't explicitly call out BDS as being anti-Semitic, and the question then is what double standards mean, and we can open up that discussion. But for the record, do you regard boycotts against Israel as being anti-Semitic, and if so, why? Do you think there's a non-anti-Semitic form of boycotts, or are all boycotts of Israel intrinsically anti-Semitic? Do they necessarily fail the test?
I would argue this. I'm going to maintain that I think that per the IHRA definition, which I think is so important to abide by, I think it's less than 100% clear. I would argue that even if BDS isn't intrinsically anti-Semitic, I would point to recent and really empirically sound studies in the UK, 2 years ago by the Community Security Trust, that showed a strong correlation between those that support BDS and those who also hold classic anti-Semitic views. So that, it seems clear based on that research and based on other studies also, that even if you can argue that BDS isn't intrinsically anti-Semitic, that those who agitate for BDS, those that campaign for it, are passionate about it, are very likely to hold classic anti-Semitic views anyway. So I think that's how I would characterize the movement.
Okay. I want to try. We have this function here called answer live. I'm not sure whether this allows you to answer the question. No, sorry, no, that's not what it does. There we go. We have a question here from Sammy Stein, Adam. Anti-Zionists want to eliminate the state of Israel, and that would lead to denying the Jews a state of their own. That in itself would seem to be anti-Semitic, according to the IHRA definition. I mean, do you think maybe that's where the definition should fall, about whether the boycott is intending to stop Israel, to eliminate the state of Israel, rather than other ends, or is just the institution of a boycott itself problematic?
All right, so that's actually a good point. I mean, even if, again, even if you were to argue, and I think it's open to debate at least, even if you were to argue that BDS isn't intrinsically anti-Semitic, the fact that the leaders of the movement do hold views that are considered anti-Semitic by the IHRA working definition, I think is a very strong case that the BDS movement, even if the idea itself falls in a gray area, that the BDS movement as a movement is anti-Semitic, because people like Omar Barghouti have been clear that, he even used the word, his ultimate goal is Israel's euthanasia.
Right.
He wouldn't countenance the continued existence of a Jewish state within any borders. So I think you have to draw a distinction between ideas, which sometimes can be complicated, and the movement. The BDS movement is clearly anti-Semitic, and I think pro-Israel activists, need to make that point more than the double standard IHRA debate, because I think that's a little more complex.
Right. Adam, we have a question coming in here. I want to go back to what you were saying before about intersectionality. It's a term that we hear a lot of. I think we hear it as much as we understand little about it. So to try to clarify, what exactly is intersectional ideology? How does it apply in the case of Israel and complicate matters for pro-Israel activists?
Yeah, I mean, intersectionality began as a relatively intuitive idea that.
I'm sorry, Adam, I just want to say just briefly, for everyone watching, please do continue sending questions in on the Q&A. We still have time. We want to hear your questions as well. So keep those questions flooding in, Adam.
Yeah, so intersectionality began as a relatively, I think, intuitive idea that the experience of prejudice that, say, a African-American woman experiences would be different than the experience that a white woman experiences, in that the white woman might experience misogyny or sexism, but the African-American woman will experience that on top of racism. So,
that's true.
That's undeniably true. Yeah, like I said, it's kind of intuitive, I think, right? But, I think others have written about this, but I think it has morphed into an ideology that has embraced an idea where there's a hierarchy of victimhood, arbitrarily determined, so that people of color, however sometimes that's arbitrarily determined, are granted this immutable victimhood status. Those that are considered white, even though those people aren't necessarily sometimes white, are seen as the oppressors. People that are wealthier are lower in the hierarchy than those who are poor. Therefore, then so it takes this hierarchy of victimhood, and it places Jews as non-victims because Jews are seen as white, even though in Israel roughly half of Jews come from a Mizrahi background. The Jews are seen as white. We're seen as rich, and certainly, there's some truth to that, right? I mean, in diaspora communities, Jews tend to do pretty well financially, and so they put us in this box where, by virtue of the fact that we're successful and in their minds, erroneously, but in their minds, white, that we don't have really much place within intersectional ideologies.
How would you recommend pro-Israel activists to go around dealing with this problem, given it's not a question about you make an argument, I'll make an argument that defeats your argument. It's about changing a whole way of thinking.
Yeah, look, there's two things. First of all, diversity in itself is a great idea. Having events that are racially diverse and have gender diversity are a great thing. But I think we need to resist arguing with pro-Palestinian activists, accepting their premises. That I don't think we should. I think we need to refute the idea that Jews that you could determine someone's victim status by virtue of their color, by virtue of their income, by virtue of their power status. I think it is such an unbelievably facile idea. It's so, I think, counter-logical, counterfactual. So I think we make a big mistake if we embrace the intersectional ideology in order to fight it. I think we need to go back to classical liberal and classic civil rights ideas that all men are created equal, right, and are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. The Martin Luther King universalist message is much more morally sound, much more powerful, and ultimately, right, I think much more successful.
We have a really interesting question here, touching on a very hot potato from Ben Stone, asking specifically about Jewish activists who not often fight for BDS, are often on the forefront. Let's be honest, sometimes the tip of the spear of certain anti-Israel campaigns. Given what you were saying about, well, it's not 100% watertight, but you think that the boycotts of Israel that are attempting to eliminate the state of Israel are anti-Semitic. How does that apply in the context of Jewish anti-Zionist activists? Are they anti-Semite, self-hating Jews? I mean, I hate that expression, but how do you square that circle?
Okay, first of all, I would rarely, if ever, use the term self-hating Jew, because I don't have clairvoyance. I can't get into someone's head and know what's motivating their activism. But I think any activism which has as its objective the end of the only Jewish state in the world is an anti-Semitic movement. So the fact that they're Jewish doesn't make that idea any less so. But having said that, I think we need to be very careful about, I think there's some people within certain pro-Israel movements that really use bad language and talk about self-hating Jews and talk about they're not really Jews. And that's not really for us to determine. Their Jewish identities is their business. However they interpret what their Jewish calling is their business. We shouldn't engage in ad hominem attacks. We should just talk about the fact that the BDS movement, whether it's advocated by a Jew or a non-Jew, has an anti-Semitic end. That is the end of the Jewish state, which per IRA is anti-Semitic.
Right. We have another interesting question here, specifically about the difference between right-wing and left-wing anti-Semitism. Certainly the anti-Israel is often discussed in the context of far left-wing activism. There is a big problem of far-right anti-Semitism as well that we shouldn't ignore. What do you notice as being the differences between the two types on campus? And I suppose to extend on this question, some people are maybe a little bit uncomfortable with the ways that maybe Netanyahu has, let's say, cozied up to certain unsavory international leaders, whether it's Jair Bolsonaro or Viktor Orban, and regimes where there are serious questions about whether their right-wing populism contains anti-Semitic elements as well.
Let me say a couple things. First of all, people are free to criticize Benjamin Netanyahu, unlike what some people say on Twitter. No one's right. No one's ever been called anti-Semitic or any, for simply criticizing an Israeli government or an Israeli leader. And you can I think reasonably make the case that he's embraced far-right leaders that make a lot of people uncomfortable. But getting back to the original question, look, I think there are basically three components, three lines of anti-Semitism. There's anti-Semitism from the far left, from the far right, and from the Muslim world. I think anybody who can claim to take anti-Semitism seriously and the fight against anti-Jewish racism seriously must speak out and be vocal against Jew hatred that comes from any of those movements. Anybody that has a hard time calling out one of those three components of anti-Semitism, I think really, you can question whether or not they're motivated by good intentions. But as far as ideologically, I think it's important to remember two things: that right-wing anti-Semitism is still a big problem, and we shouldn't make light of it. But the ideology is interesting in that, right-wing anti-Semites oftentimes take pride in their racism, right? They think that Jews are inferior and that, they're the they're the superior race, and that, they wear it as a badge of honor. The danger from the far left is that they masquerade oftentimes as anti-racist. And I think very often times the media and opinion leaders, commentators take that at face value, right? And you saw that, I think, with the Corbyn Labour Party anti-Semitism scandal. That, I think there are lots of people within Labour that generally just didn't believe that by virtue of the fact that Jeremy Corbyn was a left-winger, a socialist, an anti-racist, quote unquote, that his
That it was
mother marked.
conceivable that he might have a racist bone in his body.
Right. That, his mother marked a cable street, so therefore, dot. And I think that's so. I think there are some people like within the far left, say in the UK, who don't care that he was anti-Semitic. But I think there was a lot of people that just couldn't wrap their minds around the fact that you can be a socialist, anti-racist campaigner and truly hold horrible views about Jews. So I think that while right-wing anti-Semitism is as much of a problem in many countries as left-wing anti-Semitism, I think intellectually, politically, ideologically, it's much more challenging to fight it on its left-wing variety because of the reasons I just stated.
Right. It's interesting. You then have that horseshoe theory of the far left and the far right end up meeting up and being not that far from each other, and it ties into some of the stuff I was discussing at the beginning. That if Zionism was, the Jewish emancipation movement, the Enlightenment movement, was a push for equality within Western nations, and Zionism was a push for equality within the family of nations, you have right-wing anti-Semites, not the worst of them, but the right-wing populist anti-Semites who say, Jews, go to your own state and leave us to our own white state, but we don't want you to have equality within our state. And the left-wingers who say, sure, in principle, be equal citizens as minorities within our state, but don't be equal as your own nation in a state of your own. We have one question here. If you had to recommend one book to an anti-Zionist who is open-minded and says, look, you have one book to try to change my mind, what would it be?
Oh, that's difficult. I think you can do much worse than the Case for Israel by Alan Dershowitz. I think that that book, there's a British pro-Israel activist, Muslim pro-Israel activist, whose name I'm forgetting. I think you know who I'm talking about. His last name, I think, is Hafiz. I could be wrong about that. But he basically decided, he was raised in a very anti-Semitic Muslim environment. And he decided that he wanted to challenge the ideas that he was raised on. So he went to the bookshop, picked up Dershowitz's book, and he just had like an aha moment. He had an awakening. Now, there are good things and bad things to say about Dershowitz, but I think that's a very concise and very well argued book. It's very accessible. And I think to the degree that the person you're recommending the book to is open-minded, I think that makes a pretty persuasive case.
Okay. One last question here that has come in from anonymous. Okay, they don't want to tell us who they are. We were discussing before right-wing anti-Semitism, left-wing anti-Semitism, and it's always a question in politics about who you ally with in a fight for a common cause. And so you said, by all means, criticize Netanyahu for, cozying with certain right-wing populist leaders, but how should pro-Israel activists feel about perhaps certain evangelical Christian groups or other populist groups that are pro-Israel, but there are questions about perhaps anti-Semitic tendencies, undertones? I mean, you can't pick all your allies to be whiter than snow, metaphorically. Right. So how should pro-Israel activists dodge that question about whose support to accept and whose support to say is beyond the pale? What's the line?
That's a really good question. Look, I think to some degree it depends on the activist comfort level with some of the other political persuasions of the evangelical Christians, some of which may hold views on economics or social views that they would disagree with. So there's that. The question is, are you willing to make allies with someone who you disagree with on, say, abortion or, say, LGBT rights? And that's, I think, an individual decision. Number two, I'd recommend strongly reading our Christian media analyst, Dexter Van Zyl, has written really persuasively about the evangelical pro-Israel movement. And I think he knows a lot more about the movement than I do. But I will say that one thing that to dispel that you see the media propagating all the time. That is the only reason why Christian evangelical pro-Israel activists support Israel is because, you know, at the end of times, you know, everyone's going to go back to Israel.
It feels like we're living through the end of days now, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, that's a good point. Based on reading Dexter and reading other thoughtful commentators on the issue of Christian pro-Israel activism, I think that just, and also based on my own personal experience, I just don't think that's true. I think that represents a very small percentage of the evangelical pro-Israel movement. I think a lot of the pro-Israel evangelicals are philo-Semitic and just believe in the Bible. The Bible says, you know, if you bless the Jews, you'll be blessed. Look, so I think you have to make a distinction between, I'm personally not bothered by their theological motivations, but, you know, I'm personally bothered by some of their political motivations, at least in the American political context. So I think that's a tricky point, but I think you can do much worse. And I think I'd recommend people go to the site of Camera and look for articles by Dexter Van Zyl. He really can shed a lot of insight on the Christian community and their support for Israel and what that's motivated by.
That's an interesting perspective. I'll check it. Adam, I think unfortunately we're running out of time. So I want to thank you. The time's flown by. We've had a really interesting, stimulating conversation. And Aviva, thanks for facilitating this, and back to you. Do we have Aviva on the line?
Yes, sorry, I had to unmute myself about that. But thank you, Eylon and Adam, for providing us with such a fascinating conversation. To all our guests, thank you for joining in. We greatly appreciate that all of you took the time to be with us today. And if anyone has a question that we weren't able to get to, please feel free to post it in our discussion board on our Facebook page for this event, and we'll make sure to get to it later today or this week. And please make sure to visit our website, cameroncampus.org, and follow us on our various social media accounts on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to stay updated with our material. Please, everyone, stay safe and healthy and have a great weekend. Shabbat shalom.
Stay at home.
Stay at home.
Bye, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.